Burke, you're not pulling up a poem, you're pulling up a short story, the same short story that we've been reading for the past week. Okay. So in regards to existential crisis in Edgar Allan Poe. Hey, Johanna, why is Edgar Allan Poe so dark? Well, because all the good stuff is dark and evil. No, it's because Edgar Allan Poe was kind of rebelling against this idea that science can prove everything that you need to know. At the time period that he was in, there was this great big scientific enlightenment movement, which is very important because before that they believed the demon sat on your chest and watched you sleep, and that's what woke you up at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? So it's important that we have this scientific enlightenment movement. However, Edgar Allan Poe, like the majority of romantics, is ultimately arguing that we have to be careful upon relying on just scientific data and the scientific process to give us all meaning. Right, Chio? Chio says right. Okay? Now, we can apply this to our modern sensibilities when we hear people say things like statistics prove everything, right? If I asked you guys to find right now that there is evidence that the Earth is flat, could you find it online? Absolutely. Whether or not you believe is an entirely different thing. So when we talk about the idea of science, just like during our time period now, there is this great big questioning of what is real and what is not real. In the fall of the House of Usher, we have the question of what it means to perceive the world around us as having centering on the existential crisis. Who are you? Think about yourself. What are you? Really, Kohanna, we're going to do this on a Friday before a game? We're going to have an existential crisis? Yes! Join me. Join me on our existential crisis. What makes up who you are? Is it the way that you act around others? Is it your looks? Is it the avatar that you use when you're gaming? Who's the real you? Is the real you the person that you are around your friends? The person that you are around your family? Do you even know who the real you is? Think about you from 9th grade. Yeah. Oh, that hurts, right? But that was still you. But it's not the you, right? And the you that you are, it's different from 9th grade than it was from 10th grade. From 10th grade to 11th grade, and probably from the beginning of this year to now. And will probably be different tomorrow. So if there is no real you, because you are constantly changing, then I will ask again, who are you? So when we talk about the concert of the you and who you are in this world around you, we have to ask ourselves, if we don't know who you are right now sitting in your desk, then how do we know what the soul is, or the ego, or the identity? Now remember the video that we just watched talked about the idea of bad faith. Some of you guys have spirituality and religion that gives you answers for this. But Nietzsche argues, and again, I'm not telling you to believe this, I'm simply presenting an argument to you. Nietzsche argues that if you just take someone else's word for it and you don't actually explore that concept yourself, if you just say, well, the Bible says this or the Quran says that, and therefore that's what I believe, and you don't actually go through the process of understanding that on a spiritual level, then that's living in bad faith. If you ultimately, Caparetta, decide that you're going to identify yourself with this type of person, but you don't figure out what that means, then you're living in bad faith. When we think about Roderick Usher has lived his entire life isolated from other people. He has been with his sister, who is simply a reflection of himself, and they've been bouncing ideas off of each other. So really, Roderick Usher is just an extension of his sister, who's an extension of him. Roderick Usher and Madeline Usher are one brain. They exist as one soul and one entity, philosophically speaking. If they've isolated themselves for this long, and they have had no outside influences, then that means ultimately their mind has sat stagnant, just like that swamp. No outside water has infiltrated. Heraclitus says that you can never step into the same stream twice. Heraclitus is a philosopher. Why is it impossible for you to step into the same stream twice? Water is moving. So every time you step into the stream, it's different water, correct? We ourselves are like the stream. We are constantly changing. But is there also an essential you that makes up the you that you are? Could be argued yes. Some of you say yes, some of you go, I don't know, it's a Friday, please stop yelling at me about existentialism and Poe. Okay? Stay with me. When we talk about the idea of what it means to make the ego, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a memory that you realized later didn't actually happen? You remembered something and you knew it was true. You absolutely knew it was true. And I'll give you a for instance. My dad's gonna laugh because I'm gonna show him this video. My father, I love the man. My father is absolutely convinced that when I was 7 years old, he took me to some restaurant, or maybe it was 6 years old. He took me to some restaurant and you could eat crawfish. But it was like a lobster tank, but instead of full of lobster, it was full of crawfish. And I, being a very sensitive child, did not want this particular crawfish that I apparently had sat next to in the waiting area to die. And I made friends with this crawfish. And so when the waitress came to the table and asked what we wanted for dinner, and I said crawfish, and I wanted that particular crawfish, she said, fantastic. And then I said, I don't want you to kill it. I want to take it home. Then my father proceeds to tell me this long story about the fact that I had this particular, I think there were 2 crayfish actually, for 4 years. A crawfish that lived from, do you believe this yet? Because I don't. For 4 years, I kept this crawfish alive. I have no recollection of it whatsoever. There are no pictures that it happened. My mother insists that it's true. My brother doesn't really verbalize that well, so he can't tell me if it actually happened. So the only thing that I have is my father's memory of this particular thing happening. I don't believe him. How do I know what is real and what is not real? I have someone else telling me what the truth is. I have 2 people, right? So if it's 2 people, then it has to be true, right? I don't know. If we only rely upon ourselves for the understandings of reality around us, reality itself can get warped. Roderick Usher has only had himself in the mirror image of himself for so long that his mind, just like the house, is starting to decay. So this existential crisis that we're encountering is not only Roderick Usher's death of his sister, and not only, remember at the very end of the story, Roderick Usher himself also dies from fear, the very thing that he thought was going to happen, but also the death of his mind. And for Edgar Allan Poe, madness is a very distinct, horrifying type of death, because your mind is still alive, and your body is still alive, but whatever makes up the consciousness, and perhaps for some of you that is what your soul is not your own. So the existential crisis that we see is not just with Roderick Usher. It's not just with the house, which, by the way, is supposed to be a metaphor for the body. It's crumbling, it's falling apart, and eventually dies, and is eaten and decays. It's also for the mind. Because our narrator, just like Roderick Usher, catches madness like a cold. All right, so you guys should have your Fall of the House of Usher, Burke, not a poem, The Fall of the House of Usher, okay? And we're going to count paragraphs together so that we can pick up, okay? Are you ready? Okay, so immediately after the poem, the first paragraph begins with, I well remember that suggestion. You with me? Next paragraph, our books, the books which for years. With me? Next paragraph, I could not help but thinking of the wild ritual of this work. Ready? Next paragraph, at the request of Usher, I personally aided him. Next paragraph, having deposited our mournful burden upon the trestles within the region of this horror. Next paragraph, and now some days of bitter grief having elapsed. Next paragraph, it was especially upon retiring to bed. Next paragraph, we talked about the incubus and the succubus, yes? And the sleeping and all of those things, fantastic. Next paragraph, I had taken but a few turns in this manner. All right, so we are going to pick up at where Roderick Usher bursts into the room and says, and you have not seen it? Ready? This is why Chio hates sitting directly in front of me, because I'm so loud. I'm such a teeny tiny person, but I'm so loud, Chio. I'm so loud. It's like, lady, would you stop? Enough. All right, here we go. And you have not seen it, he said abruptly after having stared about him for some minutes in silence. You have not then seen it, but stay and you shall. And thus speaking and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm. Remember, the storm, just like in Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe uses any storms to be like, look what's happening, bad things are occurring, we're about to hit the climax, this is the brain, this is the frenzy, this is all of these things. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house did not prevent our perceiving of the lifelike velocity with which they flew, careening from all points against each other. So now it seems, remember, Roderick Usher was like, I think plants and nature and stones and fungi and swamp have consciousness. I think that they are sentient beings. I think not only are they sentient beings, they are malicious sentient beings, and they're trying to make me go insane and kill my sister. And now we're beginning to see that our narrator, remember, first person narration, he's the one telling a story. He is starting to have the same consciousness slip into his storytelling, but we can only rely on him. He's the one who's making the reality for us. He is the one who's creating the story, so we can only rely upon this unreliable narrator. All points against each other without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor were there any flashing forth of lightning. But the undersurfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as the terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exaltation. The gas around the swamp is glowing, which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. You must not, you shall not behold this. So he's like, he's trying to shield his friend, right? His friend's going crazy. So he's like, get away from the window, you weirdo, said I, shudderingly to Usher as I led him with gentle violence from the window to the seat. By the way, gentle violence is a paradox. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there's an oxymoron, which is a hyphenated word like jumbo shrimp. All right, but there's also paradox. Paradox is two concepts that are opposite, but they still work together. If I say I moved someone with gentle violence, you're able to create that picture into your head, right? You're able to be like, oh yeah, you like shoved him, but he was like careful with him, right? But the two words, gentle and violence, are opposites. This concept should not create a picture, and yet our brain does that for us because brains are cool. With gentle violence from the window to the seat, these appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tart. Remember, I told you, Edgar Allan Poe is trying to say, look, science is not reliable. Our narrator is seeing all of this crazy ish happening right in front of him. The gas is glowing. His friend is talking about his dead sister who's pounding underneath the bedroom, right? All of this craziness is actually happening. You look super cute. Don't worry about your mirror. You don't have to keep it on. You look awesome. So all of this craziness is happening right now, and he's trying to explain it away. He's like, oh, it's probably just this. It's just the storm. It's just the skeletons, the trees. It's just all of these other things. He's trying to explain it away, but the reality of the situation is something kooky is going on. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances I will read, and you will listen, and we shall pass away this terrible night together. Now, he picks up this particular copy of an antique volume. It's Ethelred, and it's basically like Sir Lancelot goes and tries to break down the door of this hermit. I'm going to skip that paragraph because, frankly, we don't have time. But if you'd like to read it, you should. Remember, whenever an author cites a piece of work, you should go back and take a look at it. I had arrived at that well-known portion of the story. I just skipped one paragraph, so we're down one. I had arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for the peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. I see you, Cafferetta, give me 1 second. Here it will be remembered, the words of the narrative run thus. And Ethelred, who was by nature of doughty heart, and who was now mighty withal on account of his powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, was of obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quick room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand, and now pulling therewithal sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder the noise of the dry and hollow sounding wood, alarmed and reverberated through the forest. At the termination of this sentence, I started for a moment, paused, and appeared to me, although I once concluded that my exited fancy had deceived me. So again, he's trying to make excuses. He's like, I think I heard, but I'm not sure, but maybe it was, but could be not. It appeared to me that from some very remote portion of the mansion, there came, indistinctly to my ears, what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. To be clear, the beginning of this night, they had just put Madeline in her tomb. 8 days pass. His friend's going crazy. Then a storm starts. He wakes up in the middle of the night and thinks he sees something in the corner of his room, feels something sitting on his chest. He's walking back and forth and back and forth. His friend comes up the stairs and is like, hey, you know what's going, something crazy's going down. Let me into your room. So he's trying to calm his friend down because his friend is being frantic and crazy. And then the storm happens. And then his friend opens up the door and he's trying to calm his friend down. And all of a sudden he's telling the story in which there is this weird sound of wood breaking. And then he hears wood breaking from beneath him. What do you think the wood breaking probably is? Oh, it's the casket. Catherine, what was your question? Oh, yeah. So come up here. It was, beyond doubt, the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention. So again, remember, he's making excuses, right? Surely that wasn't actually what I heard. Surely it was just me saying, oh, you know, there's got to be some other better excuse for it, right? I was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casement and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound in and of itself had nothing surely which could have interested or disturbed me. And I continued the story. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was so enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the merciful hermit, but in the stead thereof the dragon of a scaly and prodigious demeanor and fiery tongue, which in state guard before the palace of gold with a floor of silver, and upon the wall there hung a shield of shining brass within legend enwritten. Now, remember, this is a story about a guy who's storming a castle because, or a cave because there's a hermit in it. That's a parallel. Roger Gusher is the hermit. Ethelred is our narrator. Okay? And Ethelred uplifted his mace and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him and gave up his pesty breath with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, like whereof was never heard before. Here again, I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear, although from what direction I proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently distant but harsh, protracted, and most unusual screaming or grating sound. The exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek as described by the romancer. So maybe we are hearing Madeline Usher scream, or maybe it's the screeching of those iron gates. Remember we talked about the iron gates and how loud and clangy they were. Maybe that's what he's hearing. Oppressed as I certainly was upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, notice he still says it's a coincidence. Like he's still not, he's a great horror character, right? Because he's like, no, it can't be. It's like, you're watching the horror movies and you see them and they're like, there's a sound out there and a psycho killer. I should go look, right? And he's like, okay, here I go. So he still doesn't believe it. By 1,000 conflicting sensations in which I wonder extreme terror were predominant, I still retain sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting by any observation the sensitive nervousness of my companion. So he still is slightly sane. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had during the last few minutes taken place in his demeanor. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought round his chair so as to sit with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could but partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, yet I knew not that he was asleep from the wide and rigid opening of his eyes. I caught a glimpse of it in profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with this idea, for he rocked from side to side with gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having taken all notice of this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which thus proceeded. And now, the champion, having escaped from terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield and of the breaking up of the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, in which, in sooth, the feet upon the silver floor, what a might and great, terrible, ringing sound. Uh-oh. Coincidence number 3. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, if a shield of brass had indeed at the moment fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, I became aware of the distinct hollow metallic and clangorous yet apparently muffled reverberation. Remember, he is still saying that all of these things are coincidence. He is still trying to rationalize. I told you guys that Edgar Allan Poe, because of his placement in history right now, is saying that rational mind is not always what we can rely upon. This guy is our character in a horror film. Every clue is hinting at him, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. The audience that's reading is going, don't do it, don't do it. We are all sitting here going, don't you realize, you idiot, what's happening right now? But he is trying to rationalize, and this is Edgar Allan Poe. Remember, I've told you, you don't have to agree with it, but you got to recognize the argument. The argument that he is making is that you can't rationalize everything, that your understanding of reality, your perception of reality, which in part decides who you are and how you exist in this world, aka existentialism, all of those things are tied together, and you cannot always rely upon some scientific rational understanding. Muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed, and I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closer over to him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. So now we know that Roderick Usher's mind is completely gone. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it. I have heard it. Long, many minutes, many hours, many days. I have heard it, and yet I dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am. I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb, said I. Not that his senses were acute, and I now tell you I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many days ago, yet I dared not speak. And now, tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say rather the rending of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. And whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying up to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman, I tell you that she now stands without the door. He just described the whole movement, like everything that our narrator has been like, oh, it was a coincidence. Oh, it was the wind. Oh, it was probably just my imagination. Oh, it was this. That paragraph that we see right there from Roderick Usher, he's like, no, you idiot. This is what happened. We put her in there too early. She's been trying to scrape her way out. I have twin spidey senses, and I've been knowing for a while, but didn't say anything because I was afraid you were going to think I was nuts. And now she finally made her way out. That screeching noise that you heard was the screeching of the archway, the metal gate. That's what you heard. And now she's standing without the door. She's on the other side of that door. So the person who's crazy is the one who's making the most sense. And our narrator, the one that we have to rely upon for this reality, is making no sense at all. As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back. So he goes, she's standing right there, and then the doors open by themselves. Upon the instant, their ponderous and ebony jaws. Now notice what our narrator does. He doesn't say, oh, I get it, you're right, she was a zombie, she was a ghost, we buried her too prematurely, she's there, you're right, she opened the door. Look at what he says, here's his excuse. It was the work of the rushing gust. So to be clear, it was the wind. But then without those doors, there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, and then, with a low, moaning cry, she fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor, a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. Remember, Roderick Usher said, "I'm afraid that I will die from fear." That literally his perception of the world, his reality, his way of seeing things would cause his death. That his mental state would create his bodily demise. You start to see the connections between mind, body, and soul. By the way, that's a Cartesian understanding of self. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. You guys know that phrase? Have you ever heard that before? I think, therefore I am. So Rene Descartes basically shut himself in his room for a very long time and said, how do I know that anything is real? The only thing that I do know is real is the fact that I'm able to question whether or not I'm real. Therefore, I think, so I must be. The problem with that particular understanding is what's called solipsism. And it means that Rene Descartes can think, so he knows he is real, but he doesn't know if any of you are real. Just like I don't know if those crawfish existed. Some of you right now are like, really, on Friday for our game? Hannah, this is a little much. Sorry, bear with me. From the chamber and from the mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad. In all its wrath, I found myself crossing the old causeway, and suddenly there shot along a path the wild light, and I turned to see whence so gleam, so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon. So where's the light coming from? It's the moon, but what color is it? Red. Remember Edgar Allan Poe's got that thing about blood red, which now shone vividly through the once barely discernible fissure of which I had before spoken, and extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. So remember that crack? We talked about the crack. And the crack is supposed to represent not only the body, right? It's supposed to represent the house, and it's supposed to represent the mind, right? So if we're talking about the construct of the existential crisis, remember, when we're thinking about ourselves on this earth, and we're thinking about the fact that our lives here are transient and ephemeral. We're not here forever. And so what do we do with that existential crisis? Well, artists like Edgar Allan Poe, they make art, right? And this extends after him. He's still alive and talking to us via the story, just like Shakespeare is, right? Most people, however, will make a little them. So your parents made a little them, and you are them. But remember, Roderick and Madeline Usher, they could not make a little them. So as Roderick Usher dies, as Madeline Usher dies, as the house itself, the only thing that was left of them, cracks and goes into the swamp, is there anything left of the Usher house whatsoever? So how do we know the story actually happened? All right, hang on, we're not done. Wait, stay with me. Go Hannah, this is too much for a Friday. We're not done. Bear with me. From that chamber and from the mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, as I found myself crossing the old causeway, and suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure of which I had before spoken, as an extenuating from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. And while I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of whirlwind. Now we're completely supernatural, right? Our narrator is not playing around with this idea of like, this is just something that happened because of the wind, right? Literally the house is cracking in half and there's like a whirlwind in the middle of it. The entire orb of the satellite, meaning that the moon, the blood-red moon, burst at once upon my sight, and my brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and the dank tarn at my feet closed, sullenly and silently, over the fragments of the house of Usher. So maybe the house of Usher is sanity. Maybe the house of Usher is the actual house of Usher. Maybe it's the people. Maybe it's the family. It doesn't matter. Okay? Existential crisis. All right, you guys have about 7 minutes left. Go ahead and work on your literary terms chart. Study for the test on Monday.